Something just shifted, and most people haven't caught it yet. The United States and Israel didn't just conduct a military strike, they executed a coordinated geopolitical signal, one that was months, possibly years, in the making. And the way it's being framed in the mainstream press tells you almost nothing about what's actually happening beneath the surface. Here's what you need to understand. This isn't a spontaneous reaction to a threat. Coordinated operations between two sovereign military structures, with joint targeting, shared intelligence, and synchronized timing, don't happen overnight. These are the fingerprints of a pre-planned strategic decision, approved at the highest levels of government, backed by forces that operate well outside the public's line of sight. Now, the question isn't whether this happened. The question is, why now? What changed? Who benefits? And more importantly, what comes next for the rest of the world, including you, sitting right here in America? Because what gets set in motion in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. It travels through oil prices, through dollar dominance, through military alliances, through the cost of everything you buy. This is your world too, and you deserve the full picture. Let's start with the basics, because I think it's important that we establish the foundation before we go deeper. Iran has been in the crosshairs of American and Israeli foreign policy for decades. This is not new. What is new, what is genuinely different this time, is the level of synchronization we're seeing between Washington and Tel Aviv, and the timing of it, which tells a very specific story if you know how to read it. Think about where we are right now in the global order. The dollar system is under pressure. BRICS nations are expanding. Saudi Arabia has been flirting with Chinese trade deals settled outside the dollar. Russia and China have deepened their economic and military cooperation to a degree that would have been unimaginable 15 years ago. And Iran sits right in the middle of all of this, not as a passive actor, but as an active one. Iran has been supplying drones to Russia. Iran has been deepening its ties with China. Iran has been part of the emerging multipolar architecture that challenges the very foundation of American global dominance. So when you see the United States and Israel launch a coordinated operation against Iran, you have to understand this is not just about Iran. This is about the entire emerging world order that Iran represents and supports. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment, because the mainstream media will never frame it this way. They'll talk about nuclear threats, they'll talk about regional security, they'll invoke the word terrorism and point to Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis as if these are the reasons, the real reasons for what's happening. But here's the thing, those are the justifications. The real reasons operate at a much deeper level, and they have everything to do with who controls the architecture of global finance, global energy, and global military projection. Iran's crime, in the eyes of the Anglo-American establishment, is not that it's building a nuclear weapon, though that's certainly the stated concern. Iran's real crime is that it has refused for over 4 decades to submit to the dollar-based financial order. It has refused to price its oil in dollars exclusively. It has refused to allow Western financial institutions to operate within its borders. It has maintained a posture of sovereign independence that Washington finds intolerable, not because Iran is a military superpower, but because the example Iran sets is dangerous to the system. If Iran can survive outside the dollar order, others will follow. And that is the existential fear driving this operation far more than any missile or centrifuge. Let me take you back briefly to 1953, because history matters here, and Americans deserve to know their own country's history. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence orchestrated a coup against Mohammad Mossadegh, Iran's democratically elected prime minister, because he had the audacity to nationalize Iran's oil industry. He believed that Iran's oil should benefit the Iranian people. The West could not allow that. They removed him, installed the Shah, and kept Iran as a client state for the next 26 years. Then in 1979, the Iranian Revolution happened, and the country broke free from that arrangement. Everything since then, every sanction, every covert operation, every proxy conflict, has been a continuation of that original struggle for control over Iranian resources and Iranian sovereign policy. What we're watching right now is chapter after chapter of that same story. And here is where it gets really important for you as an American, because this directly affects your life. When the United States launches or supports military operations in the Middle East, there is always a cost, and that cost is almost never paid by the people making the decisions. It's paid by ordinary Americans at the gas pump, in higher inflation, in increased military spending that comes directly out of the national budget, and in the long-term blowback that inevitably follows interventionist policy. The Iraq War cost over $2 trillion and destabilized an entire region for a generation. The Libya intervention turned a functioning, though authoritarian, state into an open-air slave market. Afghanistan consumed 20 years and trillions of dollars and ended with a chaotic withdrawal that achieved nothing lasting. These are not ancient history. These are recent decisions made within the lifetimes of most people watching this video. And yet here we are again. So what specifically happened in this coordinated operation? Let's talk about what we know and what we can reasonably assess. What we're seeing is the product of deep intelligence sharing, joint operational planning, and a level of military coordination that requires months of preparation. This isn't two allies who decided over a phone call to act together. This is the result of integrated command structures, shared targeting databases, synchronized timelines, and a jointly approved strategic objective. That level of coordination tells you that this was a decision made long before the public trigger event, whatever justification was offered to the American people in the days or weeks before the strikes. Israel, for its part, has been conducting operations inside Iranian territory and against Iranian-linked targets for years. The Mossad's campaign of assassinating Iranian nuclear scientists, the Stuxnet cyber attack on Iranian centrifuges, the strikes on Iranian positions in Syria, all of this has been happening in plain sight with American tacit or explicit approval. What's different now is that the United States has moved from tacit support to active co-participation. That is a significant escalation. That changes the legal and moral equation entirely, because now the United States is not simply backing an ally from a distance. It is a direct participant in offensive operations against a sovereign nation that has not attacked American soil. And I want you to think carefully about what that means under international law, and what it means for how the rest of the world will respond. Because China is watching, Russia is watching, every nation in the global south that has been quietly building relationships with Iran and with the broader BRICS coalition is watching. And what they see is confirmation of something they've believed for a long time, that the United States will use military force to protect the dollar system and its sphere of geopolitical influence, international law notwithstanding. That perception has consequences. It accelerates the very de-dollarization trend that Washington is trying to prevent. It deepens the alliances between Iran, Russia, and China. It makes neutral nations less neutral. And it ultimately weakens the moral authority that American foreign policy has historically claimed as its foundation. Now let's talk about Israel's strategic calculus here, because it's worth understanding on its own terms. Israel has a legitimate security concern about Iran's nuclear program. I'm not dismissing that. A nuclear-armed Iran would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Middle East in ways that Israel would find existentially threatening. That's a real concern, and Israeli leaders have been consistent and serious about it for decades. But here's the complexity. Military strikes on nuclear facilities do not eliminate a nuclear program. History shows us this clearly. The Israeli strike on Iraq's Osirak reactor in 1981 didn't prevent Iraq from reconstituting its nuclear efforts. And in Iran's case, the nuclear infrastructure is dispersed, hardened, and deeply embedded underground. Strikes may delay the program, they cannot end it. What they can do, and what they reliably have done throughout history, is harden the resolve of the targeted nation to accelerate exactly the capability the strikes were designed to prevent. So the strategic logic of the operation, viewed through a purely military lens, is at best questionable, which means the operation is serving purposes beyond the military. It's a political signal, it's a message to Iran's leadership, it's a message to the region, and it's a message to the domestic audiences in both America and Israel, where political leaders always benefit from projecting strength regardless of the actual strategic outcome. This brings me to something I think about a great deal: the relationship between war and domestic politics. Historically, governments under pressure at home have found wars abroad enormously useful. They rally populations around the flag, they shift media attention away from internal failures, they allow leaders to demand unity and silence critics in the name of national security. I'm not saying this operation was launched purely for domestic political reasons, but I am saying that the domestic political context in both Washington and Jerusalem right now is one in which both governments benefit from projecting decisive, aggressive strength, and when political incentives and strategic objectives align, the result is almost always action. So you should factor that in when you're trying to understand why now, why this moment. Let's zoom out and look at what Iran's likely response will be, because that matters enormously for what comes next. Iran has a doctrine of strategic patience combined with asymmetric retaliation. They don't typically respond immediately or directly in ways that would give the United States a clean justification for massive escalation. Instead, they operate through their network of regional partners in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, to apply pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously. You can expect increased Houthi activity in the Red Sea. You can expect Hezbollah to make threatening gestures, if not actual strikes. You can expect Iranian-linked militias in Iraq to target American positions. All of this creates a sustained pressure campaign that raises the cost for the United States and Israel without triggering the kind of direct conventional confrontation that Iran knows it cannot win right now. This is not weakness on Iran's part. It is a sophisticated strategic response that has served them well for 4 decades. But here's where I want you to think about the danger, the real danger of where this escalation ladder leads. Every rung of that ladder is a decision point where a miscalculation can drag the entire region into a much larger conflict. If a Houthi missile kills American sailors in the Red Sea, there will be enormous pressure on Washington to respond massively. If Hezbollah fires rockets into northern Israel and Israeli civilians die, the pressure on Tel Aviv to launch a ground operation in Lebanon becomes almost irresistible. And if Iran, feeling that its very existence as a sovereign state is threatened, makes the decision to accelerate toward an actual nuclear weapon as the only deterrent that great powers seem to respect, which is, by the way, exactly the lesson that Libya and Iraq and Ukraine taught every nation watching, then the situation becomes genuinely catastrophic. I'm not predicting nuclear war. I'm describing the logical pathway that poorly managed escalation can lead to, and I think the American people deserve to have that conversation openly, rather than being fed a sanitized narrative about protecting regional stability. And what about the global economic dimension, which affects every single person watching this video? Iran is a major energy producer. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes, sits at the geographic heart of this conflict. Any serious escalation that threatens the free passage of oil through that strait will send energy prices spiking globally. That means higher gasoline prices for Americans. It means higher transportation costs, which ripple through the entire economy in the form of more expensive food, more expensive goods, more expensive everything. The American economy, which is already dealing with persistent inflationary pressures, is not in a strong position to absorb an oil price shock. And the irony, the deep, painful irony, is that the people who will suffer most from that shock are working class and middle class Americans who have absolutely no voice in the decision to conduct these operations and no stake in the geopolitical objectives they're designed to serve. I also want to address the moral dimension, because I think we've lost the habit of talking about the morality of military action in serious terms, and that's a dangerous loss. There are real human beings in Iran. 22 million people live in Tehran alone. They are not their government. Many of them, probably most of them, want the same things you want: security, prosperity, dignity, a future for their children. When we launch military operations that create explosions in populated areas, people die. Infrastructure is destroyed. Trauma is inflicted on an entire society. These are not abstractions. These are consequences of decisions made in air-conditioned rooms by people who will never personally experience those consequences. And I think Americans, who are fundamentally decent people, deserve to sit with that reality rather than having it hidden behind clinical language about precision strikes and strategic objectives. The United States has an opportunity, always has an opportunity, to lead the world through diplomacy, through economic engagement, through the kind of moral authority that comes from practicing the values it claims to hold. Every time it chooses the military option first, it forfeits a little more of that authority. And the cumulative effect of those forfeitures is visible in the world right now, in the expanding BRICS coalition, in the growing willingness of nations to trade outside the dollar system, in the declining trust in American-led international institutions. These are not coincidences, they are consequences. So where does this leave us? It leaves us at an inflection point that is genuinely consequential for the world your children will inherit. The decisions being made right now, in Washington, in Jerusalem, in Tehran, in Beijing and Moscow, are decisions that will shape the global order for the next generation. And the American people, who are ultimately the ones who fund these operations with their taxes and pay the economic consequences with their wallets and send their sons and daughters to serve in the military that executes these policies, the American people deserve to be fully informed, fully engaged participants in this conversation, not passive consumers of carefully managed information designed to generate consent rather than understanding. That's why this conversation matters. That's why you're here, because you understand that the story you're being told on the evening news is not the whole story. And you're right, it never is. Stay informed, think critically, and don't let anyone tell you that these complex geopolitical questions are too complicated for ordinary people to understand. They're not. They're your world. You have every right and every responsibility to understand it.